all, I would like to thank Professor Calva and Professor Campanini for this invitation, which opens up a new session of talks and our responsibility in this inauguration, as well as in presenting my research and to the academic community. So I hope to not betray and disappoint all these expectations. This is also my first time in public, in a public occasion, to talk directly with students. In this sense, I consider important to give you all some quick notes on my work, taking into account the methodology, approach, fields of investigation. I am a cultural and oral historian interested in problematizing the relation between the colonial past and the post-colonial conditions in Europe. And I try to problematize this kind of tension in terms of memorial processes, power relations, hegemonies, and resistances. This is a short introduction, but let's go to the paper. It's a paper dedicated to chocolate, but we can say that this kind of focus can be enlarged to other exotic foods, such as, for example, tea, spices, coffee. At the end of this presentation, we will taking into account a specific advertising in the field of coffee in order to problematize the question of race and gender, how race and gender combine in a sort of sexualization of food and in the representation of the otherness. But let's start with our trip in the field of chocolate, and let's start from a date 1502. During his fourth trip, Columbus found cocoa beans in a canoe. Those fava beans were considered as mysterious-looking almonds, and for several centuries, cocoa drink was prepared by Maya and Aztec societies as a beverage with hot water, pepper, and cinnamon. 17 years before, European colonization appropriated of this plant and decided to bring it to Europe. The act was crammed full of meanings for a conception of the world based on the European centrality and modernity. Exploring, colonizing, bringing civilization meant, among other things, to steal to Aztec this food and to raise it as a sign of the power relations in the Americas in European food culture. Cocoa moved from the table of Emperor Montezuma II to that of King Charles of Spain through the bloody violence exercised by Hernán Cortés on Native American people. The brown gold, as was called the cocoa drink, symbolized then the appropriation of a land and cultures of native people from the white man's swords and rifles. Its great effect was narrated through legends behind to which is possible to find the allegory of the promised land and the rhetoric of a wide world to whom is attributed a salvific and therapeutic role in curing European illnesses. The picture, this first picture, is taken by an important book in the field of gastronomy, namely Traité nouveau et curieux du café, du thé, du chocolat by Philippe Sylvestre Dufour, printed in 1685. This representation, in my opinion, is very important because it's the base of our path. And we can see in the behind part of the representation cocoa beans, and overlapped there's a representation of a black body, a native body. So this combination and combining these two representations is not casual, but is something that will happen in years after the conquest of Americas, and was an important trait in representing chocolate and race. Irene Fattacciu, who will give a talk in this series of seminaries, wrote an impressive book on the diffusion of a deeply exotic consumer of chocolate during the early modern period. The relevance of her volume, in my opinion, is about the transition of chocolate from an exotic curiosity to an Atlantic commodity. Besides this, to point out the interaction amongst local, interregional, Atlantic markets, democratization of chocolate consumption, as well as economic growth. She takes into account the timeline from the end of the 17th century to the end of the 18th century. And in particular, in chapter 2, she focuses during this lapse of time how Spanish authorities tried to normalize the idea of chocolate in Europe. Changes in recipes and inventories happened. Fattacciu points out how this process is strictly connected to others concerning products and foods, such as tea, coffee, tobacco, and has to be dealt with a larger framework of similar dynamics going on in other imperial contexts. Also called exotic products and food, in fact, had been associated with the cultural and geographical otherness of territories on the opposite side of the Atlantic Ocean. In order to make more attractive chocolate on the market, a sort of normalization, as said before, of chocolate was needed. From one hand, colonialists began placing importance of good use of food in New World, rather than considering them demoniacal. Many treatises were published on chocolate, such as those by Antonio Leon Pinello, Francisco Hernandez, Juan de Caldena, and many others people, and sugar was combined for this kind of normalization to cocoa beans in order to remake a new European version of chocolate. And during the 18th century, most sugar production remained firmly in the hands of the French Empire. I would like to underline that Haiti was the first sugar producer in the world. Former Santo Domingo was under the French Empire before and after. There was a very important relation in terms of economic exchanges and import of sugar. At this point, modern aristocracy made the consumption of luxury goods as a mark of distinction. This habit was connected to the creation of a series of social practices and public movements. So let's try to summarize our trip alongside the history of chocolate. First, the conquest of Americas and the importation of cocoa beans in Spain, in Europe. Second, this food was deeply connected to the conquest of the New World, the colonization of new lands and peoples through a close relation between the representation of food and colonized bodies. Third, the attempt to normalization of chocolate in order to add this food in a Western alimentation as a luxury good, as depicted by Italian painting Pietro Longhi in a board that I will show you now about a daily moment in 18th century Venice, this one. Something changed during the 19th century, in particular after 1846-1847 economic crisis, with a great expansion which was characterized by an economic and industrial sharply increase. In this sense, chocolate moved from a luxury food to a more accessible position on the market. This is due, amongst other reasons, to the affirmation of the middle class in the European economy. The end of the century is signed by a new colonial expansion in all continents outside Europe. And this last part of the 19th century is very important. We can start from the mid of the century, but the end of the century is very important for colonial expansion. And in order to understand how chocolate was important in representing Black bodies, Black colonized bodies, I would like to take into account one example. We can talk about all colonialism. All colonialism tried to use the chocolate in order to talk about colonialism, in order to talk about Black bodies and lands in Africa, but not only in Africa. And let's go to some examples about the French Empire. So Gala Peter's advertisement, his slogan was "Les premiers des chocolats au lait," was realized by Champignon Enterprise in 1906. And in this picture, there are not American native, but there's the same trait of representation. In the picture, you can see a camel and two Bedouins in the desert. In the context of the Mediterranean, in this particular moment, France put effort and was engaged in formalizing and reinforce its domains in the Maghreb, in particular in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. So chocolate became a way for representing the colonial power on so-called Orient, with its Black bodies and strange cultures. There is a close relationship between this kind of representation and what happened in Spain and whole Europe after the colonization of Americas. And I would like to add another thing. The same thing happened in United States. Kila Wazada Tompkins in Racial Indigestion. I don't know if you can see me, but this is the book. Wrote about the way to which chocolate was used to represent African American people, and we have to say, we have to point out that and remember that that period was the period after the end of segregation, but we have to remember the role of Jim Crow laws in discriminating Black people. And so there's another connection to the representation that we have seen before. Many other acts use the same canon in order to connect chocolate and elsewhere, such as the case of Banania, this one. In this case, we are not in the Maghreb, but in what was called Black Africa, so in the south and in French colonies, and the representation is different, but it's the same that we have seen before. And there are other representations such as this one. This one is the same company, Banania, very important in France. But if this representation was published in 1925, this one was published in 1947. So there's a continuity after the fall of the French Empire. And I would like to show you this one. Why? Because is another representation of Black bodies through chocolate, which talks about another place of the French Empire, not in Africa, but in the Americas, in Latin America. And finally, I would like to show you this last slide. So this slide is a poster published by one of the most important chocolate producer in France, Poulain, which was published in 1910. It's very interesting because if you see each bubble, you can see that there is not only a representation of the otherness, but there is a division of work. In the first part, in fact, there is a description of the production during which Black people are at work to pick and gather vanilla, cocoa, sugar beet, and sugar cane. And then other phases of the production are in the hands of white people. Okay, so let's move to Italy. On June 1884, a group of African people were deported in Turin for a World's Fair, the International World Fair. As was usual in that period, the Black populations under the colonial domain were exposed in human zoos. They were considered at the same time of goods and foods coming from colonies. These African people were deported by Italian authorities from Assab Bay area in the Horn of Africa, the first Italian domain in the oversea. This land was first purchased by Rubattino Company in 1869 and then sold to the Italian government. Why I'm talking to you about this story? Because in order to celebrate this occasion, pastry chef Gustavo Fastisch invented Assabesi biscuits. Assabesi biscuit and the recipe will be written only in 1946, so there is also an interesting story about connecting oral and written story, and here there are many connections to what Jack Goody pointed out about some ways of cooking and others of canonizing and writing recipes. The recipe is the following: ingredients: butter, powdered sugar, acacia honey, whole eggs, then dark and bitter chocolate, oranges zest, and a pinch of salt. But the very important thing is that there is a connection between black bodies and the use of chocolate in representing the elsewhere and in particular colonies. The name Assabesi was used after for sweets as dessert, for other sweets and desserts, such as for some candies with licorice, or licorice, or a cake invented by the same Fastisch. These two. And so let's enter in the last part of my talk, starting from two statements. First, there are many other chocolate desserts connected to Italian colonial past. Secondly, Assabesi biscuits, cakes, and candies continue to be cooked and sold today. But at this point, I would like to broaden the perspective to the whole Europe, for instance, to the Belgium with its Le Petit Mont d'Avers. Le Petit Mont d'Avers, a dessert which is connected to the colonial repression in Congo by Emperor Leopold II, or to the Tête de Nègre in France and in the Francophone countries, and Negerbrot in Austria and Germany, which is a chocolate with peanuts. In general, this paper wants to highlight two questions. Firstly, how chocolate was used by European countries and cultures to represent the otherness and alterity, in order to propose a metaphor of eating the other and the otherness as a sign of the attempt to conquest and canonize the whole world and the European taste. Secondly, there is an impressive heritage of the colonial culture after the fall of empires. During my presentation, I spent time in order to talk about representation, and this was the field of my paper. But I would like to say that, of course, this kind of reflection involves taste, good manners, appetite, and imaginary about chocolate, and of course a racist view of black bodies. As you probably know, a huge debate started around the name of a particular pasta called Sabine Rigate, produced by La Molisana. In my opinion, the question is not only the name echoing the colonial past, but the relevance to analyze with an historical approach the colonial heritage in food and food studies. And then I would like to close asserting that this kind of work is about, and my presentation was about race, but of course we have to take intersectional view and intersectional gaze in order to combine race and gender, and in order to view how many other foods and representation of advertisements were and are used in order to represent black bodies. In order to close this presentation, I would like to show you an example about coffee, this one, and this one. That is, in my opinion, a sort of sexualization of black body through the idea of a coffee, an exotic and sexual idea of coffee. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for yours. It's very interesting your speech, dear Gabriele, and it's very delicious argument because it's fantastic food, chocolate, etc. And now is naturally there's the time for the questions of the students. There are 16 students, 15 with, and then a special welcome to Daniela Pirani. This is our colleague. Do you know Daniela?
Gabriele? Yeah, of course.
Okay. Ciao, Daniela. And
Ciao, Daniela.
now it's very important the questions of students, please, if you are about a very interesting speech.
If I can
Please.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for this presentation. I really enjoyed listening.
Sorry,
Yes.
don't.
Okay, can you hear me any better?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I'm working a bit on biscuits, so I really enjoyed the part on the asabesi. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the colonies and the relationship between the colonies and food. So how did, especially like, because I was thinking now that other brands actually exploited like the colonial links in relation to biscuits. So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about the asabesi particularly and the relationship with the colonies.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for this question. So, in my opinion, there are two main topics. The first one is the idea of the otherness, as said before during my paper, and the way of representing the otherness. I would like to say that something similar happened in Paris during the international exposition, using chocolate for representing black bodies. But in the case of Italy, there's specific idea of trying to enter in a colonial context, which was firstly opened up by different nations, such as the United Kingdom, France, and before Portugal and Spain, etc. So Italian organization of the International Exposition tried to invent something similar to other expositions, such as the case of Human Zoo. Human Zoo are a sort of representation of colonies in Europe, and the representation of lands beyond European borders. And the idea of also the idea of presenting food using chocolate is not new, because in the case of different les têtes de nègre, for example, were presented during some first international exposition in Paris. And so I would like to say that Italian authorities and their organizing committee of the International Exposition try to use the same canon, the same way for representing black bodies through food. But I would like to add only this, that this approach to food in order to talk about alterities did not stop with Assabesi, but there are many others sweets, many other desserts, such as Meneliks, balls, and many other cakes used for representing specific specific bodies, specific characteristics, specific places in Italian colonies. And I would like to add just one other thing about the use of chocolate. As said before, chocolate was a way for representing black bodies, but there were others, such as, for example, coffee. Coffee during fascism and before, during the liberal period of colonialism, was used for talking about colonies, even if this kind of food, in the case of chocolate, not in the case of coffee, because comes from also from the Horn of Africa, but in the case of chocolate, comes from another land, another country, another continent. And so this way of moving the same representation on other other lands which were colonized, in my opinion, is very interesting, because allows us the opportunity to deconstruct a form of European culture.
C'è una, there's a question by chat. You see, Gabriele?
Yes, how is Sabina Rigate is connected to colonialism? Is a type of pasta? Thank you. So I think 1 month ago, there was on social networks a debate about Abyssine Rigate. Abyssine Rigate is connected to colonialism. Yes, it was a specific kind of paste used used for talking about colonization, Italian colonization. In particular, the name is connected to Abyssine. Abyssine is the name used for female people, female women, or for women in the Horn of Africa. And I would like to say that there was an impressive debate on this use of the name by La Molisana, which is the producer. But there are other traits very interesting in Abyssine Rigate, such as the representation of the sexual organ, the female sexual organ. And there is also an iconography about the sexualization, as said before, about coffee, which is connected with this name. So it's not only the name, but is a more deeply and wider reflection that, in my opinion, is important to approach.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Other questions, please?
You're welcome.
Very original argument, because it's not normal for our students in it. It's very new perspective. Very good. Okay, Khalid. Khalid is one of the most presenting and student in these in these conferences. Okay, please, Khalid. Okay.
Why did they think that it was a good idea? Thank you so much, Khalid. In my opinion, in order to reply to your question, it's important to talk about how some foods are involved in some ideas of the world, such as the case of exotism or exotic foods. And so in order to try to talk about some characteristics of food, in particular, for example, chocolate or coffee, producers used images coming from a colonial archive, an archive which is made by images and exotic images. And why they use these images? Because the goal is to give to the person who can buy this kind of food the idea, for example, of exoticism or exotism. This kind of representation, as you have seen in the case of coffee, is connected to the sexualization of the black body. And why we can use this kind of image in order to talk about coffee, for instance, because there's a sort of narration of exoticism connected to coffee, for example. And I don't know if I replied to your question, but the use of images is important for trying to characterize foods and in particular advertisements. You're welcome.
Okay, others? I'm waiting some moment, then it's still possible to finish.
Yeah, yeah.
Other questions? No? Okay. Then it's possible to finish. Thank you for your very probably that's no your very interesting conference, and now is the new conference with Professor Vincenzo Russo about neuromarketing. The conference will be in Italian language. Ok, thank you to all. Grazie Gabriele.
Thank you.
Ti volevo chiedere,
I just wanted to say that.
oh, good. Very good.
I want to say that the presentation was super interesting and thank you so much.
Yes, it's new original, very, very original. Absolutely, I agree with Francesca because it's to new perspective, no? It's not so normal aspect about food, etc. And then I hope that is naturally Gabriele Professor Proglio is a new teacher of our university. Then all the students have the possibility in the future to contact him, and then it's possible to continue this interesting argument, for example, for the thesis or degree, etc. Okay.
If you wanted to address me other questions or if you want to talk about these topics, please write me and I will be very happy to reply you and to meet you.
Yeah, absolutely. Good. This is a very important success for you. No, ti volevo chiedere, Gabriele, se good evening to all. Thank you for your presence. Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Ti volevo chiedere, Gabriele, se c'era qualcuno che tu avevi invitato per capire se erano tutti studenti, a parte Daniela, o...
Ma alcune persone che ho visto in chat, sì, erano persone invitate.
Ah, ecco.
Sì, sì. Che...
Per esempio, ti ricordi...
adesso non ho più...
Ah, ok, niente.
All'inizio, sì, sì,
C'era
sì.
una certa Laura, mi pare, anche, che forse...
Ah, può darsi, può darsi.
Comunque, bene, dai, visto, it's very, very important per rispondere alle questioni. D'accordo, Gabriele, io ti ringrazio molto e tanto restiamo in tema perché tra le conferenze e poi i famosi mitici viaggi avremo modo di risentirci. Buona serata, Gabriele. Ciao, grazie mille.
Ciao.
Ciao, a presto.
Ciao.